we were thinking about talking about risk and insurance, and try to kind of find a philosophical approach to how one should manage risk in life, because there are different risks that a person is exposed to in their life. And today in our society, there are very many insurances that you can make some contract with some company that they will insure you against all kinds of risks. Like if you can no longer work, then they will pay you an equal salary to the one that you earn at the moment. Or if you are sick, then they will pay for your medical bill. Or if your house burns down, and you know this all, of course. So, and the question that came to my mind is, how is there some kind of philosophical principle that we can use to figure out how we want to deal with this problem? Because it doesn't seem reasonable to me to just insure yourself against every smallest thing that can happen to you, because it will cost you a lot of money, and then you will be working all day just to pay all these insurances. But on the other hand, there is a certain sense in trying to reduce certain risks which can have very harmful effects if they really hit you in life. And so we started with the example of medical insurance, which is one of the most common or most costly insurances that most people have. And I think there, Christoffer, you wanted to tell us some things about health insurance in the US as a kind of entry point into this discussion.
Thank you, Amos. Yes, that would be a very interesting point to bring up. But perhaps before I go into that, I could briefly touch upon a definition of what insurance is and its basic purpose. So you could say that an insurance is a program in which you pay a little sum to some company or enterprise of some sort in order to cover potential high costs at unforeseen circumstances or unforeseen circumstances. So as many people would be familiar with, you have fire insurance as an example of this, that you probably will not have your house burned down. That is not something that happens very often, but you might think, okay, but what if it does happen? It is a possibility that it could happen. And if it happens, I'm in big trouble because I'm not able to cover all the costs. Therefore, it seems reasonable, according to the philosophy behind insurance, to make some contract, as you pointed out, with the company, say, and have an agreement that you pay a little bit of money, let's say a specific sum each month, into that company, and have this guarantee that if your house does burn down, then that company will give you a lot of money to cover all the costs involved in that. So that is the basic idea of insurance. And then you could say the question becomes, well, what should you have insurance, or where should you have the insurance? About what? To what extent should you have insurance? And to what extent should you just pay things out of your own pocket? So where do you draw the line? And that's a very good question. And that brings me into some very specific political or social issues, like, as you mentioned, healthcare in the United States. In the United States, we see that health insurance has become a very, very expansive program that covers a lot of different things. It seems that you are supposed to have a health insurance for almost everything that happens to you, that there is almost nothing that you can pay out of your own pockets. And this has contributed to a huge problem with high costs in the healthcare industry. Because the thing is, if you are not paying for healthcare products out of your own pocket, then you wouldn't be as caring necessarily about the price of that which you pay, because now all the costs are going to the health insurance company. And this, you could say, distorts demand. As some of you might know, we have this basic economic principle of supply and demand, that the price of a product in a market is based on the number of goods or products available, the supply, and the demand, how much people are willing to pay to get this product. And if you pay out of your own pocket, then you know that, okay, I will care a lot about the price because now I have to pay with my own money. But if you have an insurance company paying this for you, then you don't have to look at the price that much anymore. It becomes the responsibility of the insurance company. Therefore, the providers of health products can now jack up the price very high without losing a lot of customers, because they will just have the insurance company back them up. And this creates this huge healthcare cost dilemma. And I've heard a good analogy to this problem, which also goes back to the general issue with insurance itself. And that is the hypothetical example of a grocery insurance. Now, imagine if you had the grocery insurance, so that every time you went to the store, instead of you paying for all the food and all the things in the grocery yourself, you had this grocery insurance company pay everything for you. Now, what is going to happen to the price of all those products in the grocery? There's going to be a high increase, a very big increase in the price, because now you don't have this traditional system of supply and demand where the consumers care very much about the price, and therefore you will have a huge problem with high costs in the grocery market. And therefore many people would suggest that we need to completely change the insurance system in the United States. We need to drastically reduce the role of the insurance and reform things a lot. So this is a very interesting issue to think about, and we can thereby see that how we understand insurance and what we do about the idea of insurance, where to apply it and where not to apply it, will result in a lot of different consequences, and it will have impact on people's everyday lives. So those are some interesting points to bring up in this regard.
Yes, I think that was a very good introduction that you made here, because for two reasons. The first is that I think the definition is very helpful to know what we are talking about, because already when you formulate it, that the idea of an insurance is to basically you have an event that can happen to you, which is very unlikely, but which has a very big negative effect if it should happen to you. And then you form a contract so that many people can basically spread the load of this event that might happen to one of 10,000 every year. So then already with this definition in mind, we see what an insurance should actually be. And then you also very nicely pointed out the problem with many kind of insurance policies or insurance contracts today, which is that they got away from this original idea of an insurance, and now it's more kind of like just socialized healthcare. So instead of everybody paying for his own healthcare bill, the idea is that you kind of just everybody pays into this huge pot, and then everybody gets treatments that are paid out of this pot. And this immediately creates this problem, as you said, that it increases the demand artificially, because now actually in order that I get something out of this whole deal, I have to be the one who takes above average healthcare services. I have to consume more than average, because if I consume less than average, then I pay more than I consume. And so the idea is at once in everybody's mind that they can kind of get a lot of benefits and put the cost onto someone else. And that's, as you said with your example with the grocery insurance, that's a very bad system, because then everybody would try to pay as little as he can and take as much as he can. And somewhere things don't add up, and so the price of the insurance keeps increasing, and then everybody starts to, yeah, so then you have a big problem. And so, yeah, I think from this definition, it would actually seem that insurance should only cover things that are above a certain threshold of cost and also below a certain threshold of likeliness. So an event like getting a cold, which is highly likely that this happens to you once every couple of years, shouldn't be covered by an insurance, because that's not what an insurance by its nature or by its definition is supposed to do. And so I think from this principle, we can very quickly see what it should and shouldn't do.
Right, yes, those are good points. And also touching upon the issue as you spoke about, incentives about how to use money, I'm reminded of this idea by Milton Friedman, the famous economist, Nobel laureate economist, who said that there are 4 ways to spend money. The first way is that you use your own money on yourself. So you use money out of your own pocket and go and buy something to yourself. In that case, you care both about the price of the product, because it's your own money you're spending, and you care about the quality of the product, because you're going to use that on yourself. Second way is to use your own money on somebody else, like spending money to buy a birthday gift. And then you care about the price because you're still paying out of your own pocket, but the quality, you might not care as much about the quality as you would if you spent the money on yourself. Now, of course, there are obviously cases where that is not the case, because some people have a great interest in this guy they're buying the present to. But if you look at it from an economic point of view, thinking about incentives here, then quality would not necessarily be more concerned about, the person would not be more concerned about that compared to spending money on himself if you look at incentives. And then the third way is to spend someone else's money on yourself. And in that case, you care about the quality because you're spending the money on yourself, but the price is not that important because you are not the one spending money. And then you have the fourth way, which Milton Friedman would probably say is the worst way. And that is where you spend someone else's money on someone else, in which case you do not care that much either of price, because it's not your own money, or quality, because you're not spending it on yourself. That's a very interesting point, and that's very relevant to understanding politics, the welfare state, and problems related to that as well. And here we see that this is relevant to insurance, because you're using someone else's money, that is the insurance company, on yourself. And that will not create the best kind of market adaptation to make sure that the healthcare providers or providers of any product will make sure that the price is cheap enough to get enough customers, because now the customers do not care that much about price. So that is something to take into account. And remember, just like the grocery insurance would be a bad idea. So you could say then that, as you pointed out very well, insurance has a place in society, as when you think about the concept itself, that okay, there are certain situations that are extreme and might be situations where you don't have enough to cover the costs of the consequences, like if your house burns down. but it's very improbable that it happens, and you don't want to save a lot of money yourself for a situation that might never appear or probably never happen. But it's okay to have a sort of security and guarantee that if it happens, then you will be fine. Therefore, it is rational or reasonable to have insurance in some cases, but we clearly see that the idea of insurance, the purpose, is for extreme situations, emergency situations that might happen to someone, but it is improbable. Like if your house burns down, or let's say you have a car and you have a car insurance that if your car is destroyed in an accident, then you will have a company cover the costs of that. But as you talked about, there are cases where something unfortunate happened to you, but it's very likely that happens, like getting a cold or hurting your arm or buying some basic things that you need for some everyday things. You shouldn't have an insurance for that, because that is a part of your life. That is a thing that you should expect to spend money on. So that should come out of your own pocket. And insurances should be reserved for extraordinary circumstances, not ordinary circumstances. So it's important to keep this distinction in mind.
Yes, I think that was a good thing that you brought up here with these 4 ways of spending money, which helps everyone intuitively understand certain problems in the way, for example, our healthcare system is organized at the moment in the West. And I was just thinking of this example that some healthcare plan, for example, they pay a certain amount of money for your gym membership. And that just seems very ridiculous to me, because I don't need an insurance to pay for my gym membership. Either I want a gym membership, then I can pay for it myself, or I don't want one, in which case I don't pay for it. But yeah, this idea, and it goes a little bit into, there is this image of the golden cage. So there's this like a prison cell, but the bars are made out of gold, and the cushion on the bed where you sleep is very nice. And so some people think that it's a good idea to sit into such a comfortable golden prison cell. But I really don't like this idea of sitting in a golden prison cell and being told, and it's kind of, some people call it the nanny state, so that some authority manages your life for you, except of you being in control of your own life. And there is this argument that, people make mistakes, people make stupid decisions. And so wouldn't it be better if someone else made all of these decisions for them, so that he knows the outcome will be good? But I think this is highly problematic, and I think what is happening at the moment with these health insurance companies is exactly this kind of thing, that more and more people are kind of moving into this direction of this golden prison cell.
Right. Yes, we see that when you have insurance become such a huge part of people's lives and economy, then you become very dependent upon huge financial structures, and you lose this independence of your life. And it also centralizes a lot of information in the hands of a few, in the hands of a few bureaucrats, you might add, because the insurance company is going to have a lot of information about you, your life, your situation, your income, and all that sort of stuff. And you could say that to expand insurance into more and more areas of life, that is a globalist idea in the way that it will centralize information more and more in huge institutions instead of making you responsible more and more for your own everyday life. So that is also a concern, you could say. And I also thought about this related problem to insurance, that there are cases, for instance, in the United States, where you have to pay for things, or in other words, that you have an insurance that covers things that is not relevant to your personal life, even though it might be relevant to other people's life. For instance, if you buy a health insurance and all you really need is, okay, if I get really, really sick, let's say I am seriously injured in a car accident, okay, perhaps I can have an extraordinary amount of money from the insurance company to cover a huge surgery or something, but that's the only thing I need. I don't need anything else but that. But when you look for an insurance on the healthcare market, you find insurances that cover a lot of things that you don't need, like insurance against results or diseases resulting from smoking. But let's say that you don't smoke yourself, that becomes completely irrelevant to your life. Or insurance related to diabetes, but you don't have diabetes. And that seems to be another problem with the healthcare system in the United States, that there are these government regulations or mandates that force insurance companies to cover many different sorts of things. But then all insurances will cover these things, even though they're only relevant for some people. And I think this is one of the problems, that of course, in addition to this other problem of healthcare or health insurance being so expensive in the first place, but also that it is so expensive in what it covers, that makes it artificially more expensive for people who don't need such an expensive and large insurance. And that has only increased and intensified with the Obamacare program, which has just made things worse, it seems.
Yes, these are good points that you bring up here. And also, it makes things also worse in that it takes away the responsibility of behaving as an individual in a healthy manner. Because now that, for example, I don't know, all kinds of treatments for smoking or being very obese or being very unhealthy in another kind of way are covered by the insurance, then the price of doing these things which are bad for yourself decreases. Because I, as an individual who smoke, can offload the costs which that may produce for me in the future onto the whole society. And so it makes actually bad behavior more likely, because the risk isn't as great to engage in this bad behavior. So I think that's one problem that this brings with it. And the other thing is, you mentioned centralization of information, but it's also just centralization of resources. So if you look in many places, like for example, even here in Switzerland, I think the insurance cost that my wife and I pay each year, it's not exactly as high as the taxes, but it's somewhere in the same order of magnitude. It's maybe half as much as the taxes. And so this creates a huge pool of money. And then more and more aspects of your life are starting to get linked to this to this pool of money, because just that's like, I don't know, it's a significant part of what you earn goes into this pile of money. And then, for example, let's say now, I don't know, you need some physiotherapy, or you need some doctor to take care of something, you got the cold, or you broke an arm, or something which isn't really a big deal. But then, of course, you also now want to have this paid from this pool. because you feel, hey, I'm paying into this pool all the time, so I also want to get something out of it, because else it would just be a complete loss for me. And so then you will only now be willing to go to a doctor where the treatment can be paid from this large pool of money. But then this now has an effect on the whole behavior of the doctors, because now every doctor has to have his services being approved by these big insurance companies, because perhaps some insurance company will say, oh no, this procedure that you are using here is not according to our standards, and so therefore we will not pay if you visit this doctor, but you have to go to this other doctor. And this then influences the quality basically of the medical treatment that you can even receive, because certain forms of treatment which are not accepted you will not find them anywhere, because this big pile of money is now pulling all the doctors in a certain direction. And so it really affects the whole economy when you create these huge centralized piles of resources.
That's a very good point that you made there. That's very true. Another serious problem with this whole system. And also, I just had this thought that if you have insurance companies and you have this general set of rules, let's say regulations from the government, that mandates that you have to cover all these different things in order to be accepted, then that would create a cartel of insurance companies, or at least create a centralized oligopoly, which is a market dominated by a few huge enterprises, instead of having many small localized insurances. Because to run an insurance company, that of course involves money. It's something you have to pull resources into. Capital is necessary to run an insurance company. And if you are supposed to cover a lot of different things in your insurance, not just a very few things for some very specific things or purposes, but rather a whole lot of different things related to smoking, related to diabetes, or weight problems, and all these different things at once, then you have to become a very huge insurance company. You have to have a large structure and a large supply of capital, you might say. And many small insurance firms would not survive with so large requirements. I think there is something similar in the banking system, that there are these requirements that in order to be validly registered as a bank, you have to have so much capital that only huge banks, large banks with a lot of capital, can actually function that way. But small banks will struggle in those cases, and we can see that with insurance companies as well. It is an economic problem. It will, you could say, undermine competition and undermine localized insurances, because I think that the idea of small firms or small enterprises in a specific community that covers costs for some of its members, not only would that be good economically because you have a lot of competition, but also it seems more harmonious, and it seems better to have a system where you could say it is integrated in the local community, and you have a greater degree of trust between the members of that community and those who run the company, because it's a small community. But if you have large financial structures, it becomes more anonymous. Trust becomes undermined, and you lose competition, as I mentioned. So that's another issue to think about.
Yes, I think this is also a good point that you mentioned here, and it's very true. If you have regulations that mandate huge requirements for every product, then only huge companies can deal with this requirement. And then this is kind of, by its very nature, it leads to a more centralized economy where you have a very small number of very large companies that provide a certain type of service. And then immediately you increase the probability that some form of cartel begins to develop, because if you have just 5 companies and the probability that a 6th one will appear is almost 0, then if these 5 companies can just start to cooperate, and this mustn't even be like that they formally meet and formally decide, haha, we will now rob the public, but it just happens by when people have similar incentives or a similar goal in mind, then they automatically start to cooperate in this direction. So there are many examples of this. One example that I heard, which is very impressive, was during the First World War. There were these trenches between France and Germany, and these soldiers were stationed in these trenches, and very soon a form of cooperation between the French and German troops started to emerge. And this looked like this: I will not shoot you and you will not shoot me. And how they did this is to demonstrate to the other party that they have very good marksman skills. There was, for example, like a night lamp that was used to illuminate the territory, let's say on the French side. And so the German shooters would always hit this night lamp. They were like ding, ding, ding. They would always hit this lamp. And so the French would know, okay, they know how to shoot. So they are purposefully not shooting me, but instead shooting at this lamp. And so the French soldiers would do the same thing in the other direction. And there was no contract. They never talked with each other, but just because they had similar incentives, then a form of cooperation emerged. And such a thing can, of course, happen very easily with 5 big companies that just kind of behave in a way that when all 5 of them behave in this way, then it's good for all 5 of them and comes at the cost of the public in this case. So yeah, this is a problem. And we made a video once where we talked about how big business loves big government. And this goes exactly in this direction, what we are seeing here. And I think also, as you said, if you would have more competition and more smaller and more local enterprises, then first, this problem would be reduced. And second, these small local enterprises also know better what people need, because it's not clear that the medical requirements of all people, let's say in Germany or the United States, but even in Switzerland, are the same. Perhaps in the south there is more sun, and so people have more skin cancer, and in the north there is some other thing, and so perhaps people have more depression because they don't get enough sunlight or whatever, I don't know. But not all local communities have the same probability of a certain problem arising.
Valuable points that you brought forward there, and an interesting story about those soldiers. And if I understood it correctly, they had this, you could say, implicit agreement with each other, and the purpose was simply to not shoot at each other in order to, you could say, have a pause from all the shooting, generally speaking. Was that the purpose? Or
yes, it was, as you said, an implicit agreement where both sides figured out my probability of surviving is better if I behave in this way. So yeah,
interesting. Yeah, so that's a reflection of the phenomenon that you can have this implicit agreement because they have common interests. And we can see this take on several forms, including the markets.
If I may, there are two other interesting areas where these forms of implicit agreement work. One of them is government itself. So there are many, like this whole lobbying, this has become a very big aspect of what happens around a government of a large company, is that certain how do you call these, representatives of large companies will kind of be there where the people from the government meet, and they will kind of give them like propositions like, perhaps you could change this law in this and that manner. We think it might be beneficial for, and they phrase it with nice words. And of course, they never say explicitly, if you change this law, we will give you $1 million. But politicians have noticed that if they change the law in that way as a large company would like it, then somehow there are large campaign contributions for their next campaign when they run for office. And this is another example of an implicit agreement. It has never been said explicitly, but both sides know that if they behave according to the rule, then the other one will also, because it's good for both of them. They both profit from it. And so that's a very interesting example of this phenomenon as well. Another one might be criminal contracts. So if I hire a hitman, then if I don't pay him, he cannot go to the police or to the justice system and say, this person didn't pay me for my service. But still, or blackmail, like there are these ransomwares that they take a company's hard drive and they encrypt them, and then they demand a ransom so that they will give them the password to decrypt their own data. And when the company pays, then they get the password. And this is also an implicit agreement, because the people who are the criminals know that, well, if we cheat the company and don't give them the password even after they paid, then no one will ever pay in the future. And so they would destroy their own business model if they would cheat on this contract, if you want to call it so, even though it was never signed or explicitly stated.
Interesting points that you brought forward there. Yes, and regarding this relationship between big business and big government, if I can mention Milton Friedman again in his book Free to Choose, I think he said that, at least in his time in the 80s, vast numbers of huge financial and economic enterprises in the United States had huge offices in Washington, D.C. And I think it's that even headquarters, that the main offices were in Washington, D.C. Well, why would it do that? What is it that it's so important in Washington, D.C.? Well, of course, the government, and to have a workable relationship with them, or whatever term you could use, which would of course benefit them when they write legislation, as you pointed out, campaign contribution and all that. And I think sometimes even big business is behind the drafting of new regulations, because they see that here is a way we can use this and exploit this to squeeze competition. And it's interesting to look at the late 19th century and early 20th century, where you had large firms in the United States trying to figure out a way to cartelize industries and to create mergers and oligopolies without having small competitors bothering them. And eventually they had to use government help to have these different commissions, creating different regulations and requirements, and thus helping to squeeze out small competitors. And it seems very reasonable to suggest that this is what we see in the insurance market as well. And when you have a small number of firms with a huge market share each, then with that power, they can have some liberty, you might say, to choose what kind of product they will give the customers. They can provide very expensive products, and they might not care that much about the quality of the insurance itself, because you don't have all this competition. And also, as you pointed out, you can see a problem with lack of specialization. If you have this large structure of insurance companies which have customers from all around in the country, then these customers will become very insignificant, individually speaking, and their individual situation and problems will be sort of, you could say, abstracted away, because now you, instead of having particular individuals and persons, you have masses of this anonymous or faceless mass of customers which you have to deal with. And that is something completely different than having, say, a local small insurance firm in a, let's say, a village even. And perhaps the entrepreneur behind that firm knows personally his customers, and that would make the whole enterprise much more personal, and it would be much better for trust and making it trustworthy, and also for accountability. Because if people know you very well and you have this personal relationship to your customers, then you will be more, because you could say, held more accountable in that local village. But with with big structures, you have accountability being weakened. And I remember we talked about this in an earlier conversation as well, that with huge companies, accountability become more and more abstract because of limited liability and all that. And we see here, hence, multiple problems with this system of huge oligopolies. So yes, it's a sad situation to be in. And also, we could say the very same thing about the welfare state. Some would say that the welfare state works as a sort of mandatory insurance, because you pay some taxes into the government, and if something happens to you, you get sick, well, then the government will cover your expenses. And in Norway, we have this to a very large degree. We have a very huge welfare state system, and the United States also have welfare state programs like Medicare and Medicaid for Americans below a certain income level to cover their expenses. And that also creates the same problems. You have the government spending someone else's money, the taxpayers, on someone else. So you have bad incentives, the 4 ways of spending money, as we talked about. And you have this abstract and faceless and bureaucratic relationship between the government and the people, as we also talked about before. And yes, you create a problem of supply and demand not really being about what the customers want the price to be, because they're not paying out of their own pocket. It's covered by someone else who doesn't care that much, and hence you have huge prices and inefficiencies. So yes, it's a sad situation.
Yes, you brought up some good points, and I think you summarized it well. And this brings me to an interesting second question that I have in this how do you say, connected with what we have been talking about, and that is the question: how should you as an individual deal with living in a society where certain institutions or certain insurance institutions have become corrupt? So let's say you are, as we all are, living in such a society where insurance is getting more and more expansive, the welfare state is expansive, taxes are growing, like these huge aggregated pots of resources are just keep growing, and companies are getting more and more centralized, and like things are not going in the direction that we would wish them to go. And so how can you, or should you as an individual, deal with living in such a society?
That's a very huge question. And there are probably many distinct points one can bring up, and perhaps one would say a complicated issue. But I suppose a general principle would be to become more independent of these corrupt institutions, as we talked about earlier in this conversation. Avoid having insurances for many things that you can pay out of your own pocket. That will be the right thing to do, I would say, to avoid this centralized structure of control and resources and power into these huge institutions. Try and find alternatives. Try to find local, small ways of dealing with certain things instead of having to deal with huge enterprises. Recently, I was thinking about this very issue in the context of money, especially this issue about whether you should use cash or digital currency. And when the problem with using digital currencies like credit cards is that that will be easily that is traceable, and you centralize a lot of information in huge structures. But if you use cash, then you become more independent from this financial system. So that is a very specific issue, a particular application of this principle. But yes, in general, try to be more independent from these institutions, find alternative ways to deal with your life and things you need in your life. Also, I think we talked about this in a conversation, try to make or produce things yourself. If there is certain things that you have a choice between either buying something at a large company, or you can make things from scratch yourself without having too much inconvenience, then try that and become more independent. Or if you can find a small local company making things locally, if you can do that. So yes, there are probably many things one can bring up here, but that's at least an initial thought that I mentioned when you asked that question.
Yes, I think this is a good thought, because as far as I can see it, there are only really two alternatives, or maybe you can also make like a combination of both, because either you try to stay in this game and you try to get also more from this pile of resources that you put onto it, and then you are kind of saying, okay, I will, for example, I don't know, try to have my my hobby now paid by this insurance company because I call it a sport which is preventative and good for my health or something like that. Or you try, as you said, to become more independent of these more and more corrupt institutions. And I think to the extent that institutions are becoming corrupt, it's probably a good idea to become independent from them, because typically, yeah, when things are like a little bit corrupt, then they don't just stay that way, but over time they grow worse. And so it's definitely, in my mind, also a good thing that you to try to be able to do as many things as you can in life without depending on huge institutions, but maybe trying to do it more locally, because then perhaps you know the people, or as you said, the problem of accountability, or also the problem of having different alternatives. So yeah, I think that's a good point that you brought up here. And when I asked this question, there was this this idea that came through my mind that is quite an old idea. It is already mentioned in the Bible. It says, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And it goes a little bit in this direction, because I am forced to pay into this medical insurance. I don't have the choice. So, okay, then I have to pay it. But that doesn't mean that I then also have to go and beg the insurance company to pay for certain things that I want in life. I can just pay this money as the state demands of me, and then let it go and live my life according to how I think that it's good to live. And I think this is probably in the long term the better alternative than to then swallow this hook and then get more and more dependent on institutions that don't really care about you.
Right, good points you brought up. And one could mention that when you have a specific thing in front of you and you are wondering whether you should buy it or have a contract with a company or something similar or not, you could ask the question, do I really need this? Do I really need this to have a better life, or can I let go of it and do something different? Because there is this materialist commercial culture that we are surrounded by in the world today, where people buy a lot of things and in that way become dependent upon these huge enterprises. But many of these things are unnecessary. They don't need them. They can actually live a content life without buying these things. So find out whether, or not find out, but think about specific things and whether you actually need to buy them or to have this relationship with this business, or whether you can actually just ignore it and do something else with your life. I think if you truly ask yourself that question and let go of many things you otherwise would have bought, you will find yourself in a better position than the alternative.
Yes, I think that's also a good point. That's a very good point indeed, because today it's quite cheap to have the things that you really need in order to live. And many things above that are luxury. Most of the things that most of us have in our homes are luxury goods. They are not necessary. And therefore, if you can learn to, as you said, let go of more things or just not really desire them anymore, then you have solved the problem in the best possible way, because then not only are you no longer dependent on any large institution, but you are no longer dependent on it at all, because you're not even dependent on yourself to provide this thing. You can just exist without it. And so I think that's a good point. I like that.
Right. And when you think about it, the huge companies, the commercial enterprises, they want you to desire their products. That's what all the advertisement is all about. Have this, you will be so lucky. If you get this, it's so great to have this, and make you desire them. But if you can just ignore that, then you do the exact opposite of what the big companies want, and you become more independent from them. So we need to seriously do away with all the mass advertisement and avoid this materialist, commercialist, if one can use that term, culture.
Yes, I think that's a good point. That's really a good point. And you are very right that the whole point of all of this advertisement is to just make you desire a lot of stuff which you don't really need in your life. So